The morning sun barely peeked through the kitchen window as Melody hurried to get ready for another long day. She grabbed her worn-out work shoes and tied them tight, knowing she'd be on her feet for the next 12 hours. Her small apartment was quiet except for the soft breathing coming from the bedroom next door, where her grandmother was still sleeping peacefully. Melody had been working at the Golden Spoon restaurant for almost 2 years now. It wasn't the job she had dreamed of when she was younger, but it paid the bills and helped her take care of Grandma Rose. Every morning, she'd kiss her grandmother goodbye and promise to bring home leftover soup or bread from the restaurant. The Golden Spoon wasn't just any restaurant. It was the kind of place where rich people came to eat expensive food and make big business deals. The tables had white cloth covers, the wine glasses sparkled under fancy lights, and every plate cost more than what Melody made in a day. She had learned to smile and be polite, even when some customers treated her like she was invisible. Walking to work, Melody passed by the old music store where she used to take piano lessons as a child. Through the dusty window she could see the same black piano sitting in the corner. It made her heart ache a little. She remembered when music was everything to her, when she dreamed of playing in big concert halls with hundreds of people listening. Those dreams felt so far away now. After high school, she had gotten into a good music college with a scholarship. For 4 years she studied hard, practiced for hours every day, and graduated with honors. Her professors said she had real talent, that she could make it as a professional pianist. But when she started looking for jobs, doors kept closing in her face. "We're looking for someone with more experience," they would say, or "We already have enough piano players." Sometimes they didn't even bother to listen to her play. They would just look at her and shake their heads. Melody began to understand that the music world wasn't as welcoming as her college had made it seem. The restaurant was already busy when she arrived. Tony, the manager, was rushing around checking tables and counting money. He was a decent man who treated his workers fairly, but he was always stressed about keeping the wealthy customers happy. "Morning, Melody," Tony called out. "We've got a full house tonight. That businessman, Richard Hawthorne, is coming in with his usual crowd. You know how he is, so just keep your head down and do your job." Melody nodded. She knew Richard Hawthorne well. He was one of those customers who made her job much harder than it needed to be. He owned several big buildings in the city and thought his money gave him the right to treat people badly. He would snap his fingers at servers, complain about everything, and make jokes that weren't really funny at all. The other servers didn't like him either, but they all needed their jobs. Lucy, who had been working there for 5 years, once told Melody, "Just smile and take his money. Men like that never change, but our paychecks depend on keeping them happy." As the day went on, Melody served businessmen their expensive lunches, elderly couples celebrating anniversaries, and young people on dates. Most customers were polite enough, though some barely looked at her when she took their orders. She was used to feeling invisible. During her break, she sat in the small employee room and ate a sandwich while looking at job listings on her phone. There was an opening for a music teacher at an elementary school, but it required 3 years of teaching experience she didn't have. A church was looking for a piano player, but the pay was so low she couldn't afford to take it. "Still looking for music jobs?" asked Carlos, the cook who had become her friend over the past year. "Always," Melody said with a tired smile. "Grandma Rose keeps telling me not to give up on my dreams, but sometimes I wonder if I should just accept that this is my life now." Carlos shook his head. "My wife always says that when you have real talent, the universe finds a way to show it off. Maybe your time just hasn't come yet." Evening arrived quickly, and the restaurant filled with its usual dinner crowd. Melody straightened her black uniform and checked her hair in the mirror. She had learned to look professional even when she felt exhausted. Richard Hawthorne walked in at exactly 7 o'clock, just like he always did. He was a tall man in his 50s with gray hair and expensive clothes. Behind him followed 3 other businessmen, all talking loudly about some deal they were working on. They took their usual table in the center of the restaurant, where everyone could see them. Melody took a deep breath and walked over to their table with menus and water glasses. The men barely glanced at her as she set everything down. "Good evening, gentlemen. Can I start you off with some drinks tonight?" Richard looked up at her with cold eyes. Well, if it isn't our regular server. What's your name again?" "I can never remember." "Melody, sir." "That's right, Melody. How fitting for someone who probably dreams of being on stage instead of serving tables." The other men chuckled, not because it was funny, but because they thought they should. Melody kept her smile in place. "Can I get you something to drink? Bring us your most expensive wine. We're celebrating another successful business deal. Not everyone can afford to eat at places like this, you know." As she walked away to get their wine, Melody felt her cheeks burning. She had dealt with Richard's comments many times before, but tonight they seemed to cut deeper. Maybe it was because she had been looking at job listings all day, reminding herself of how stuck she felt. The evening continued like many others. Richard and his friends ordered expensive steaks, sent back their food twice claiming it wasn't cooked right, and made loud jokes that other customers found annoying. Melody refilled their wine glasses, brought them fresh bread, and tried to stay out of their way as much as possible. Near the end of their meal, Richard called her over again. "Melody, my dear, we need more wine. But be careful this time. This suit costs more than you probably make in a month." She nodded and carefully lifted the wine bottle. The dining room was crowded, and another server rushed past her carrying a large tray. The slight bump was all it took. The wine bottle slipped from her hands and splashed across Richard's white shirt and expensive jacket. The restaurant went silent. Every conversation stopped. Every fork stopped moving. All eyes turned to their table as Richard stood up slowly, wine dripping from his clothes onto the floor. "You clumsy fool," he shouted loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look what you've done to my suit." "Do you have any idea how much this costs?" Melody felt her face go hot with shame. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Hawthorne, it was an accident. I'll pay for the cleaning, I promise." "Pay for the cleaning?" Richard laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "This suit costs more than you make in 6 months. You think your little waitress salary can fix this?" The other customers were staring now, some looking uncomfortable, others just watching like it was entertainment. Melody wished she could disappear into the floor. Tony rushed over from across the restaurant, his face red with worry. He had seen what happened and knew this could turn into a disaster for his business. Richard Hawthorne wasn't just any customer. He was connected to half the wealthy people in the city. Losing him could mean losing many other important clients too. "Mr. Hawthorne, please accept our deepest apologies," Tony said, wringing his hands nervously. "We'll take care of everything. The dry cleaning, a new suit if needed, whatever you want." Richard looked down at his wine-stained clothes, then back at Melody, who was still standing there with her head down. The whole restaurant was watching now, waiting to see what would happen next. Some people had even taken out their phones, though they were trying to be sneaky about it. "You know what, Tony?" Richard said, his voice getting louder. "I don't think sorry is good enough this time. Your little server here has ruined my evening, embarrassed me in front of my business partners, and destroyed an expensive suit." He gestured toward his friends, who were nodding along like they agreed with everything he said. Melody looked up, her eyes starting to fill with tears. "Please, Mr. Hawthorne, I said I was sorry." "It really was an accident. I've never spilled anything on a customer before." "Never spilled anything before?" Richard repeated, making his voice sound surprised. "Well, that makes it even worse, doesn't it? Maybe you're just not cut out for this kind of work. Maybe you should find a job more suitable for someone like you." The way he said "someone like you" made several people in the restaurant shift uncomfortably in their seats. Lucy, who was serving another table nearby, looked over with worried eyes. She wanted to help, but she couldn't risk her own job. Richard walked around the table, getting closer to Melody. "You know what I think? I think you people need to learn some respect. Need to understand your place in the world." "Richard," one of his business partners said quietly, "maybe we should just go." But Richard was enjoying himself now. He liked having everyone's attention, liked feeling powerful. No. I think our little server here owes us something more than just an apology. She's ruined our dinner, after all." He looked around the restaurant, his eyes landing on the beautiful black piano that sat in the corner. The golden spoon had put it there to make the place look more fancy, though nobody ever played it. It was just decoration like a painting or a fancy vase. "You know what would make this right?" Richard said, a mean smile spreading across his. "Frere, our clumsy waitress should entertain us. Look at that piano over there. I bet someone like her knows how to play some music for us." The suggestion hung in the air like a bad smell. Everyone understood what he was really saying, what he really meant. It wasn't about the music at all. Tony looked between Richard and Melody, trapped between protecting his employee and keeping his business alive. Mr. Hawthorne, I don't think that's necessary. We can handle this another way. Oh, but I insist, Richard said, his voice getting that fake friendly tone that made everything worse. Come on, it'll be fun. I'm sure she knows some appropriate songs. Something that fits. Melody's hands were shaking now. She understood exactly what was happening. Richard wanted to humiliate her even more, to make her perform like a trained animal in front of all these people. If she said no, he would probably demand that Tony fire her on the spot. If she said yes, she would have to endure whatever cruel game he had planned. I don't really play piano, she lied, hoping he would drop the idea. Richard laughed. Oh, come now. Don't be modest. I'm sure you've got some natural rhythm in you. Everyone knows your people are born with musical talent. Several customers looked away, uncomfortable with how obvious Richard was being now. But nobody said anything. Nobody stood up to defend her. They all just sat there watching like it was a show. Richard, this isn't appropriate, said another one of his business partners, a younger man who looked genuinely uncomfortable. Inappropriate? Richard turned to his friend with raised eyebrows. What's inappropriate is having my evening ruined by careless service. What's inappropriate is wearing a ruined suit. I think a little entertainment is the least she can do to make up for it. Melody looked around the restaurant desperately. The other servers were avoiding her eyes. The customers were either staring at their plates or watching her like she was some kind of circus act. Even Tony looked helpless, caught between doing what was right and protecting his business. Play us something nice, Richard continued, walking toward the piano and patting the bench. Something cheerful. Maybe some jazz. I'm sure that comes naturally to you. Every word felt like a slap. Melody knew that everyone in the restaurant could hear the ugly meaning behind his polite words. This wasn't about music or entertainment. This was about power, about putting her in her place, about reminding her and everyone else who was important and who wasn't. Mr. Hawthorne, Tony tried again. Maybe we could just comp your meal and no. I insist on the piano performance, Richard cut him off. It's the least she can do. Besides, wouldn't want people thinking this establishment doesn't know how to handle these kinds of situations properly. The threat was clear. If Tony didn't make Melody play, Richard would spread the word that the Golden Spoon couldn't control its staff. He would tell his wealthy friends to eat somewhere else. He might even post bad reviews online. In a business that depended on reputation, that could be deadly. Melody realized she was trapped. If she refused, Richard would make sure she got fired. She might even have trouble finding another job if he spread stories about her around the city. But if she played, she would be giving him exactly what he wanted, the chance to watch her suffer. She thought about Grandma Rose at home, counting on the money Melody brought home every night. She thought about the rent that was due next week and the medicine her grandmother needed. She thought about all the job applications she had filled out with no response, all the doors that had been closed in her face. Fine, she said quietly, the word barely audible. What was that? Richard cupped his ear dramatically. I didn't hear you. I said fine. I'll play something. Richard clapped his hands together like he was delighted. Wonderful. See everyone? Problem solved. Sometimes you just have to know how to handle these situations. Melody walked slowly toward the piano, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. Every step felt like a mile. The restaurant was completely quiet now except for the sound of her footsteps on the wooden floor. Even the kitchen staff had stopped what they were doing to watch. When she reached the piano bench, she stood there for a moment with her back to the room. Her hands were still shaking and she could feel tears threatening to fall. Richard and his friends had turned in their chairs to get a better view. Other customers were watching too, some looking curious, others appearing uncomfortable but unwilling to leave or speak up. Well, Richard called out. We're waiting. Don't be shy now. Melody sat down on the bench and lifted the piano cover. The keys were beautiful, clean and white, waiting for someone to bring them to life. She hadn't touched a piano in months, not since the last time she had snuck into the music building at her old college to practice. She placed her fingers on the keys and took a deep breath. Richard was probably expecting her to stumble through some simple song, maybe play badly so he could laugh at her even more. He wanted to see her fail, wanted to confirm whatever ugly thoughts he had about her. But as Melody sat there, something changed inside her. All the years of study, All the hours of practice, all the dreams that had been pushed down and buried, they all came rushing back. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. "Baby, you've got a gift. Don't let nobody take that away from you." She looked down at the keys and made a decision. If Richard wanted a performance, she would give him one he would never forget. Melody's fingers hovered over the keys for just a moment longer. She could hear Richard behind her, probably expecting her to fumble through some simple tune that he could mock. She could feel the eyes of every person in the restaurant watching her, waiting to see what would happen next. Then she pressed the first key. The single note rang out clear and pure across the silent restaurant. It was followed by another, then another, as Melody began to play one of the most challenging pieces in all of classical music, Chopin's Piano Sonata, No. 2. Her professor in college had called it music for the gods, a piece that separated real pianists from people who just knew how to play. The opening melody was soft and haunting, each note placed with perfect precision. Melody's hands moved across the keys like they had been waiting for this moment their entire life. All those years of study, all those hours of practice in tiny practice rooms, all the dreams that had been pushed aside, everything came flooding back through her fingertips. Richard's smug smile began to fade as he realized this wasn't what he had expected at all. He had been waiting for something he could laugh at, something that would prove whatever point he thought he was making. Instead, he found himself listening to music that belonged in the finest concert halls in the world. The melody grew stronger, more complex. Melody's left hand began a deep rolling bass line that seemed to make the very air in the restaurant vibrate. Her right hand danced over the higher keys, creating a conversation between the different voices of the piano that was both beautiful and technically stunning. Lucy, who had been serving tables just moments before, stopped what she was doing entirely. She had never heard anything like this before. The businessman at table 6 forgot about his phone call. The elderly couple celebrating their anniversary looked at each other with wonder in their eyes. As the piece moved into its second movement, Melody's playing became even more remarkable. Her fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and accuracy, never missing a note, never hesitating. The music filled every corner of the restaurant, turning the dining room into something magical. Carlos peeked out from the kitchen, his mouth falling open. He had always known Melody was smart and kind, but he had no idea she possessed this kind of incredible talent. Other kitchen staff crowded behind him, all of them staring in amazement. The music told a story without words. It spoke of dreams deferred but never forgotten, of talent that couldn't be hidden no matter how hard the world tried to ignore it, of dignity that no amount of cruelty could destroy. Every person in the restaurant felt it, even if they couldn't put it into words. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This wasn't going according to his plan at all. He had wanted to embarrass Melody, to put her in her place, to make himself feel powerful and important. Instead, he found himself face to face with something he couldn't control or diminish. Pure, undeniable genius. His business partners were staring at the piano with expressions of shock and respect. The younger man who had tried to stop Richard earlier was leaning forward in his chair, completely captivated by the performance. Even Richard's oldest associate, a man who usually only cared about money and deals, seemed transfixed by what he was hearing. The third movement began, and Melody's playing reached new heights. Her whole body moved with the music now, swaying slightly as she navigated passages that would challenge even professional concert pianists. Sweat beaded on her forehead from the physical demands of the piece, but her concentration never wavered. Other customers began turning in their chairs to get a better view. Conversations that had been whispered during the first part of the performance stopped entirely. Waiters stood frozen with trays in their hands. The usual sounds of a busy restaurant, clinking glasses, rustling napkins, quiet chatter, all disappeared, replaced by the most beautiful music most of these people had ever heard live. An elderly woman at a corner table had tears streaming down her face. She recognized the piece immediately and knew exactly how difficult it was to play. She had studied piano herself as a young woman, before life took her in different directions. She understood that she was witnessing something extraordinary. The music built to an incredible climax, with both of Melody's hands working in perfect coordination to create sounds that seemed impossible for just one person to produce. The piano sang and thundered, whispered and roared, all under her complete control. Richard found himself unable to look away, even though every note felt like an accusation. This young woman he had tried to humiliate was revealing herself to be more talented than anyone in the room, including him. All his money, all his business success, all his social connections, none of it mattered in the face of what she was doing right now. The final movement approached, and Melody played with even greater intensity. Her fingers seemed to barely touch the keys, yet every note rang out with perfect clarity. The technical difficulty of what she was performing was staggering, but she made it look effortless, natural, like breathing. Tony stood behind the bar, his mouth hanging open. In all his years running restaurants, he had never seen anything like this. He realized he had been looking at Melody wrong this whole time. She wasn't just a waitress who happened to work for him. She was an artist, a master of her craft, someone with a gift that most people could only dream of possessing. The music swirled through its final passages, each phrase more beautiful than the last. Melody's playing had transformed the entire atmosphere of the restaurant. What had started as an evening of casual dining had become something none of them would ever forget. As the piece neared its end, the complexity somehow increased even more. Melody's hands moved in a blur across the keyboard, creating cascades of notes that seemed to flow like water, like wind, like pure emotion made audible. The technical mastery required was beyond what most people could even comprehend, let alone achieve. Richard's face had gone completely white. He looked around the room and saw the expressions on everyone's faces: awe, respect, admiration. These were the same looks people gave when they heard famous musicians perform at the city's most prestigious concert hall. They were looks that Richard himself had never earned, no matter how much money he made or how many buildings he owned. The final notes approached. Melody's playing grew softer, more delicate as the piece wound toward its conclusion. But even in its quietness, the music maintained all its power and beauty. Every person in the restaurant held their breath, not wanting to miss a single sound. And then, with one last perfect chord, the music ended. The silence that followed was unlike anything the restaurant had ever experienced. It wasn't the uncomfortable quiet that had filled the room during Richard's cruel demands. This was the profound silence that comes after witnessing something truly magnificent, when people need a moment to process what they've just experienced. Melody sat still at the piano, her hands resting on the keys, her head slightly bowed. She had poured everything she had into that performance, all her training, all her passion, all her dreams that had been dismissed and ignored for so long. For those few minutes, she had been exactly who she was meant to be. Then slowly, someone began to clap. The applause started with one person, then two. Then suddenly the entire restaurant erupted in the most enthusiastic clapping anyone had ever heard in that dining room. People weren't just clapping politely like they might at a nice dinner show. They were on their feet, applauding with the kind of passion usually reserved for world-famous performers at sold-out concerts. Melody turned around on the piano bench, her eyes wide with surprise. She had been so focused on the music that she had almost forgotten where she was. The faces looking back at her weren't filled with pity or embarrassment anymore. They were filled with genuine amazement and respect. The elderly woman from the corner table was making her way across the restaurant, walking carefully but with determination. Her name was Catherine Wells, though nobody in the restaurant knew that yet. What they also didn't know was that she had spent 30 years as the director of the city's most prestigious music conservatory, before retiring just 2 years earlier. "Young lady," Catherine said when she reached the piano, her voice shaking with emotion, "that was absolutely extraordinary. I have heard that piece performed by some of the world's greatest pianists, and your interpretation was as beautiful as any of them." Melody stood up from the piano bench, still not quite believing what was happening. "Thank you, ma'am. I studied it in college. Where did you study?" Catherine asked, her experienced ear having already told her that this wasn't just college-level playing. "Riverside Music Conservatory," Melody replied. "I graduated 3 years ago." Catherine's eyebrows shot up. Riverside was one of the most respected music schools in the country. Students didn't just stumble into that program, and they certainly didn't graduate without exceptional talent and dedication. Meanwhile, Richard was still sitting at his table, looking like he had been hit by a truck. His business partners were no longer paying any attention to him. The younger man had gotten up and was walking toward the piano, wanting to add his own praise to what others were saying. "That was incredible," he said to Melody. "I've never heard anything like that outside of a professional concert hall. What are you doing working as a waitress?" It was an innocent question, but it hit at the heart of everything Melody had been struggling with for years. She looked down at her server's uniform, suddenly feeling embarrassed about the contrast between what she had just accomplished and where she found herself working. "Music jobs are hard to find," she said simply. "I have bills to pay." Catherine was listening to this exchange with growing anger, not at Melody, but at a world that could let such talent go to waste. She had spent decades in the music industry and knew exactly what kinds of barriers Melody had probably faced. "What instrument did you focus on in school?" Catherine asked. "Piano performance with a minor in composition. And since graduation? Have you been able to perform professionally at all?" Melody shook her head sadly. "I've auditioned for orchestras, applied to be an accompanist, even tried to get jobs teaching music. Nobody seems to want to give me a chance." Carlos had come out of the kitchen and was standing nearby, beaming with pride for his friend. He had always known Melody was special, but even he hadn't realized she possessed this level of incredible skill. "Melody," he said, "why didn't you ever tell us you could play like that?" She shrugged, looking embarrassed. What was the point? It's not like it was going to change anything. Catherine felt her heart breaking a little. She had seen this story too many times during her career. Brilliantly talented musicians who got discouraged by the industry's barriers and slowly gave up on their dreams. But she had never encountered someone with Melody's level of natural ability working as a server in a restaurant. "Do you have any recordings of your playing?" Catherine asked. "Any videos of performances?" "Not really. I made a few recordings for my college applications years ago, but they're probably not very good quality." "We need to fix that immediately," Catherine said firmly. "Do you have tomorrow off?" Melody looked confused. "I'm supposed to work, but I could probably get someone to cover for me. Why?" "Because I'm going to make some phone calls tonight, and I want you to come to my house tomorrow afternoon. I have a beautiful grand piano, and we're going to make some proper recordings of your playing." The conversation was happening loudly enough that other people in the restaurant could hear it. Word was spreading quickly through the room about who Catherine was and what this might mean for Melody. Tony approached the group, looking both amazed and a little worried. "Melody, I had no idea you could do that. Why didn't you ever mention that you were a trained musician?" "You never asked," Melody replied, not unkindly, but with a truth that made Tony realize how little he actually knew about the people who worked for him. Richard finally stood up from his table, his face red with embarrassment and anger. He had been the center of attention when the evening started, holding court with his business associates, feeling powerful and important. Now everyone in the restaurant was focused on the woman he had tried to humiliate, and nobody was paying any attention to him at all. "This is all very nice," he said loudly, trying to regain control of the situation, "but it doesn't change the fact that she ruined my suit." The comment fell flat. After what they had just witnessed, his complaint seemed petty and small. Several people actually rolled their eyes or shook their heads in disgust. Catherine turned to look at Richard with the kind of cold stare that only a woman who had spent decades dealing with difficult people could manage. "Sir," she said in a voice that could have frozen water, "you just witnessed one of the most remarkable musical performances I've heard in years. And you're still talking about your clothes?" Richard's business partners were looking at him now with expressions ranging from embarrassment to outright disapproval. The younger man actually took a step away from Richard, clearly not wanting to be associated with his behavior. "I don't care how well she plays piano," Richard said, his voice getting louder as he realized he was losing control of the situation. "She's still just a waitress who can't do her job properly." The words hung in the air like a bad smell. After what everyone had just experienced, the comment revealed more about Richard than it did about Melody. People were looking at him now with the kind of disgust usually reserved for someone who had said something truly awful. Catherine walked over to Richard, moving slowly and deliberately. Despite being in her 70s, she carried herself with the authority of someone who had commanded respect her entire career. "Let me tell you something," she said quietly, but in a voice that carried across the entire restaurant. "I have worked with musicians my entire life. I have heard performances by people whose names you would recognize. People who sell out concert halls all over the world. What that young woman just did would be impressive on any stage, in any venue, anywhere in the world. She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. The fact that someone with her talent is working as a server isn't a reflection of her worth or her abilities. It's a reflection of a system that fails to recognize and nurture true gifts. But your behavior tonight, your cruelty and small-mindedness, that's just a reflection of who you are as a person. The restaurant was completely silent again, but this time the silence was different. People were watching Richard, waiting to see how he would respond to being called out so directly and thoroughly. His face was red now, whether from anger or embarrassment nobody could tell. His business partners were looking anywhere except at him. One of them was actually gathering his things, apparently ready to leave. "I don't have to listen to this," Richard said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier in the evening. "You're absolutely right," Catherine replied. "You don't have to listen. You can choose to learn something from this experience, or you can choose to stay exactly the same small person you were when you walked in here tonight." Richard looked around the restaurant one more time, perhaps hoping to find some support, some ally who would take his side. Instead, he found dozens of pairs of eyes looking at him with expressions that ranged from disappointment to contempt. Without another word, he threw some money on his table and stormed toward the exit. His business partners hesitated for a moment, then followed him, though they kept their distance as if they didn't want to be too closely associated with his behavior. As the door closed behind them, the restaurant seemed to collectively exhale. The tension that had filled the room was finally gone, replaced by something much better: excitement about what might happen next for Melody. 3 weeks later, Melody stood backstage at the Grand Theater, the same venue where she used to dream of performing when she was a music student. Her heart was pounding, but it was a different kind of nervousness than she had felt that night at the restaurant. This was the good kind of nervous energy that comes before doing something you've always wanted to do. Catherine had worked miracles in those 3 weeks. The recordings they had made at her house had been sent to every major orchestra and music venue in the region. The response had been immediate and overwhelming. Phone calls, emails, and meeting requests had poured in from music directors who couldn't believe such talent had been hidden away in a restaurant. Tonight was Melody's debut as a solo pianist with the City Symphony Orchestra. The concert had sold out within hours of being announced, partly because of Catherine's reputation and connections, but mostly because word had spread about the mysterious waitress who could play like an angel. 5 minutes until curtain," the stage manager announced, poking his head into the small room where Melody was waiting. She looked at herself in the mirror, adjusting the beautiful black dress that Catherine had insisted on buying for her. It was the first time in her adult life that she had worn something specifically designed for performing, and she could hardly believe the person looking back at her. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Grandma Rose. "Baby, I'm sitting in the front row with Carlos and Lucy and Tony. We're all so proud of you. Now go show them what I already knew, that you're destined for greatness." Melody smiled, thinking about how much had changed since that awful night with Richard. The incident had actually made the local news after several customers posted videos online. The story had spread across social media, with headlines like, "Waitress's amazing piano performance stuns restaurant," and "Hidden talent discovered after customers' cruel demand." The publicity had been mostly positive, focusing on Melody's incredible skill and the way she had turned an attempt at humiliation into a triumph. Richard, on the other hand, hadn't fared as well in the court of public opinion. His construction company had lost several major contracts after the videos went viral. Business partners had distanced themselves from him, not wanting to be associated with his behavior. The younger businessman who had been with him that night had even written a public letter apologizing for not speaking up sooner and donated money to a scholarship fund for underprivileged music students. But Melody tried not to think about Richard anymore. Catherine had taught her that holding on to anger would only hold her back from embracing the opportunities that were now opening up before her. "It's time," the stage manager said, returning to escort her to the stage. Melody walked through the backstage corridors, her footsteps echoing softly on the polished floors. She could hear the murmur of the audience beyond the curtain, over 2,000 people waiting to hear her play. As she stepped onto the stage, the applause was immediate and warm. The lights were bright, but she could make out familiar faces in the front rows. There was Grandma Rose wearing her best dress and beaming with pride. Carlos and Lucy were sitting next to her, both of them looking amazed to see their friend and co-worker on this prestigious stage. Catherine was in the front row too, having insisted that she wouldn't miss this performance for anything in the world. Next to her sat the conductor of the symphony, a stern-looking man who had been skeptical about featuring an unknown performer, until he heard Melody play during their first rehearsal. The piano on stage was magnificent, a full-sized concert grand that gleamed under the spotlights. Melody had practiced on it several times over the past week, getting used to its touch and tone, but it still took her breath away every time she saw it. She sat down at the bench and adjusted it slightly, just as she had been taught years ago in her college classes. The audience grew quiet, waiting for the music to begin. Tonight's program was ambitious. She would be performing 3 different pieces, including the same Chopin sonata that had started everything at the restaurant. But first she would play a Mozart concerto with the full orchestra, something she had only dreamed of doing when she was a student. The conductor raised his baton, and the orchestra prepared for the opening notes. Melody placed her hands on the keys, feeling the familiar comfort of the smooth ivory beneath her fingers. The first notes of the Mozart concerto filled the concert hall, and immediately Melody knew this was where she belonged. The orchestra supported her beautifully, and she found herself playing with even more confidence and expression than she had during their rehearsals. The music soared through the hall, reaching every corner and touching every heart. In the audience, people who had come out of curiosity were quickly realizing they were witnessing something special. This wasn't just a talented amateur getting her first big break. This was a true artist finally finding her rightful place. During the second movement, Melody caught sight of someone in the audience who made her do a double take. It was David Chen, the famous recording company executive she had read about in music magazines. Catherine must have invited him, knowing that this performance could lead to even bigger opportunities. But Melody didn't let the presence of such important people distract her from the music. She had learned that the most important thing was to stay connected to the joy and passion that had made her fall in love with piano in the first place. The concerto ended to thunderous applause. People were on their feet before the final note had even finished ringing through the hall. Melody stood and bowed, feeling overwhelmed by the response. After a brief intermission, she returned for the solo portion of the program. This was her chance to really show what she could do without the orchestra, to demonstrate the full range of her abilities. She began with a gentle piece by Debussy, letting the impressionistic harmonies wash over the audience like water. Then, she moved to a fiery listitude that showcased her technical abilities, her fingers dancing across the keys with spectacular speed and precision. Finally, she came to the Chopin sonata, the piece that had changed her life that night at the restaurant. But tonight, she played it differently than she had then. That night, she had played it with desperation, with a need to prove herself in the face of cruelty. Tonight, she played it with joy, with the confidence of someone who finally knew her own worth. The performance was even more remarkable than it had been at the restaurant, having a proper concert piano, perfect acoustics, and an audience that was there specifically to hear her play brought out nuances in her playing that hadn't been possible before. When the final notes faded away, the silence lasted for several seconds, that perfect moment of appreciation that follows truly great performances. Then the applause began, and it seemed like it would never stop. People were shouting "Bravo" and throwing flowers onto the stage. In the front row, Grandma Rose was crying happy tears while Carlos and Lucy cheered loudly enough to be heard over the entire crowd. Catherine stood and applauded with the dignity of someone who had spent her life around great music, but with the enthusiasm of someone seeing a former student achieve everything they had dreamed of. As Melody took her final bow, she caught sight of a familiar face in the back of the theater. It was Richard, standing by himself near the exit doors. He wasn't applauding, but he wasn't leaving either. He just stood there, looking at the stage with an expression that might have been regret. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowded theater. Melody felt a flash of the anger she had carried for weeks. But then something else took its place, on not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of understanding that his cruelty had been born from his own smallness, his own fear of being unimportant. She nodded slightly in his direction, not a gesture of friendship, but an acknowledgement that he had played a role in bringing her to this moment. Then she turned back to the audience that was still celebrating her triumph. After the concert, the backstage area filled with people wanting to congratulate Melody and discuss future opportunities. David Chen introduced himself and talked about recording contracts. Several orchestra directors handed her their cards and invited her to audition as a guest soloist, but the moment that meant the most was when Grandma Rose finally made it backstage and wrapped Melody in the biggest hug of her life. "I always knew this day would come," she whispered in Melody's ear. "I just didn't know it would be so beautiful." 6 months later, Melody was preparing for her first international tour. Her debut album had been recorded and would be released next month. Music magazines were calling her the discovery of the year and comparing her to legendary pianists of the past. She had moved out of her small apartment and into a beautiful house where Grandma Rose could have her own room and a garden to tend. She had established a scholarship fund for young musicians who couldn't afford music lessons, ensuring that other talented people wouldn't have to wait as long as she had for their chance to shine. Sometimes, when she was practicing in her home studio, she would think back to that night at the restaurant. What Richard had intended as the ultimate humiliation had become the catalyst for everything she had achieved since. She had learned that sometimes the worst moments in our lives are actually doorways to the best ones, that cruelty can be transformed into beauty, that hidden talents will eventually find a way to be revealed, and that no one can keep a true gift buried forever. The little girl who had dreamed of playing in concert halls had finally found her way home. And the music she made now was more beautiful than ever, because it carried within it the story of everything she had overcome to get there.